And the first topic I want to cover is psychopathy. So by the end of this week, you'll be able to define what psychopathy is, outline the various ways that we have of measuring it, explain also what some of the underlying biological underpinnings are, and then describe the association between psychopathy and violence. And then lastly, we'll think about some kind of wider questions and implications for, the criminal justice system and legal scholars. So psychopathy is a personality disorder, okay, characterized as an extreme personality disorder, okay, but I want to start more broadly with what a personality disorder is, just quite quickly, and then we'll get on to talking about psychopathy. So, a personality disorder is affecting how a person feels, thinks, behaves, how they relate to other people. And it's comprised of traits that become inflexible, okay, and then have an impairment on that person's life, right? So, there's a personality trait of orderliness, right? And so maybe you're high in this trait, and maybe you like to keep a structured environment, and maybe you like to be hygienic and make sure you're always washing your hands when you've been touching things that may have got them dirty and so on. And that on its own is not anything that's problematic. But if it's at the extreme, right, and it's so inflexible and it's so extreme that you can't go 5 minutes without thinking you need to wash your hands, and you think you have to bathe several times a day, and it's causing this level of impairment on your life, right, then it might be at the level in which it can be classed as a disorder, okay? So it's, traits that are evident in everyday life, right, but just taken to the extreme. So in the DSM-5, there's 10 particular personality disorders, and they're collated into 3 clusters. We have the first cluster, cluster A, which is to do with more odd, eccentric behavior, and then cluster C, which is to do with kind of anxious, withdrawing, fearful behavior. But for the purposes of this, the second cluster is the one that's relevant, the one that's to do with more erratic behavior, over-dramatic, over-emotional behavior. So this is where we find, borderline, antisocial, narcissistic, these personality disorders, okay? So these are the 10 disorders listed in the DSM. Just if you want to see what the kind of equal translation is of them in the International Classification of Diseases by the World Health Organization. That's the first column. The ICD is actually the official diagnostic manual for diagnosing mental illnesses in the US, but the DSM is actually more popular, amongst most psychologists. So the DSM is usually what, we're using as a framework. Now, in the DSM-5, psychopathy is not actually listed as a personality disorder, and it hasn't been previously either because it overlaps so much with antisocial personality disorder. But in the most recent revision in 2022 of the DSM-5, there is actually now a classification in which one can be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and then also have the psychopathy label. Okay? It's an additional diagnosis, okay, to antisocial personality disorder that's possible, okay? Because as I'll go on to show you, psychopathy is really a more extreme version of antisocial personality disorder, okay? If you meet the criteria for psychopathy, you will have also met the criteria for antisocial personality disorder, okay? But only a minority of those who meet the criteria for antisocial personality disorder also meet the criteria for psychopathy, okay? Because it's more extreme. So just a little bit about what antisocial personality disorder is first, and then we'll talk about how psychopathy is more extreme. So there must be a pervasive pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others since the age of 18. One must be at least 18. We don't diagnose children with a personality disorder. Must show evidence of a conduct disorder before age 15, which is the precursor to antisocial personality disorder. And then the antisocial behavior can't be explained by other mental disorders. So this mostly seems pretty clear cut, right? Except maybe what does this first point mean? what exactly is a pervasive pattern of disregard for others? Well, according to the DSM, there's 7 possible examples of this, okay? And at least 3 of them have to be present in order for one to be classed as having antisocial personality disorder. So you can see them listed here. It's a failure to obey the laws, social norms, impulsive behavior, pathological lying, irresponsibility, a lack of remorse, okay? And so long as at least 3 of these are met, then that would count as this first point having been met, okay? And then so long as the other 3 are also met, then one meets the level for antisocial personality disorder. So antisocial personality disorder is pretty common amongst forensic populations, okay? 3% of the general population have an antisocial personality disorder, okay? But at least about 80% of the prison population have an antisocial personality disorder. Whereas psychopathy is much more extreme and so much more rare, okay? 1% of the general population have psychopathy, so a third of that with antisocial personality disorder, and about 15 to 25% of the prison population, okay? If we're looking at more violent offenders like murderers, it's going to be about 25%. If we're looking at more across the board, it might be closer to 15, okay? So somewhere around 20% of the prison population have psychopathy. So that's the group with the most extreme personality disorder. The definition of psychopathy from your textbook is that psychopaths are dominant, selfish, manipulative individuals who engage in impulsive, antisocial acts and feel no remorse or shame for their behavior, despite it having a negative impact on others. Now, interestingly, this description of psychopathy seems to exist across cultures, okay? Across cultures, across countries, across continents, we see a word for someone who is only out for themselves, okay? And so long as it's to their benefit, okay, they'll screw over the others in their community, okay? They're not concerned about them. They have very little empathy or remorse. They're incredibly selfish, okay? They would seem to meet this description of what psychopathy is. Now, psychopathy is not one thing, okay? It's a collection of traits, of psychopathic traits, okay? And so people vary in the degree to which they are psychopathic, okay? It is a spectrum, right? So most people would be low on this spectrum, okay? It's not a normal distribution because these are mostly antisocial, pretty extreme traits, okay? But still, you differ on this spectrum. Now, there is still a cutoff point, okay? The psychopathy checklist is the gold standard for measuring psychopathy, okay? Frequently used in the criminal justice system. And for research purposes, the classification is 25 out of 40. I'll talk about this in more detail, okay? But there is a cutoff point, of course, in which we say once you're above this score, okay, then you're classed as a psychopath. But there is still varying degrees of characteristics, right, upon this spectrum. Now, yes, it is true that most psychopaths are men, okay, but women can, of course, also possess psychopathic characteristics. And in some cases, female prisoners are also classed as psychopathic as being high enough on this high end. A caveat to this is that this concept of psychopathy has come from observing inmates, okay, male inmates, okay, who are the worst of the worst and who have the superficial charm and who are not mentally ill, okay. That's really where it comes from. It comes from The Mask of Sanity, a book by Harvey Cleckley. So it's a group who are not cognitively impaired, they're not delusional, they're not seeing visions, they're not committing their crimes because of some mental illness, okay. They have a moral impairment, okay. They do not care about right and wrong, okay. It's a disorder of the personality, not a impairment of the mind, okay. But this concept of psychopathy has come through observing this subgroup of prisoners, right? And then we use instruments for measuring psychopathy by seeing if we can identify these characteristics in others. But it's all based upon observations of male prisoner samples, okay? So obviously it might be the case that, if there's different characteristics found in the worst of female offenders, okay, then maybe we're not picking up on some of those characteristics by using these sorts of assessments. Now, not all psychopaths are violent, okay? 1% of the population are psychopaths, and many of them do not go on to commit crimes or act violent in any way. Robert Hare has written a lot on CEOs and the business world and how there is an overrepresentation of psychopaths within this subgroup in comparison to the general public. And it's true also for some other fields, okay? And we'll talk more about that on Thursday. But basically, if there is the promise of reward, because psychopaths are incredibly reward-seeking, and they care a lot about dominance and status and, you know, the esteem of others, they're incredibly narcissistic. So if there is the promise of rewards and status and dominance, then that's going to be a field that will attract psychopaths, okay? And so there will be more of them than there would be in other fields. And they're also likely to take risks, okay? They're not very prone to anxiety or fear. And so again, if there's a field in which it can pay off quite substantially to take risks, then again, that might be a field in which we'll find an overrepresentation of psychopaths. Now, psychopaths can typically make very good first impressions, okay? And strike one as being relatively normal. They have quite often a gift of the gab. They have this superficial charm. They know what to say, okay? Even though they might not be able to feel anything when it comes to doing something wrong, it has no emotional impact on them. They are not insane. They know the difference between right and wrong, okay? So they know how they should come across and what the norms are and so on, which is really what differentiates them from a lot of other prisoners, right? Because most prisoners are disorganized and they're offending, right? Most crimes are reactive and disorganized. So psychopaths are more like the exception. Now, psychopathy and antisocial personality disorder are overlapping but distinct concepts, okay? Because psychopathy is more extreme and it encompasses the same characteristics that make up antisocial personality disorder and more, okay? Which I'll go on to discuss. You might also have heard of the term sociopathy or being a sociopath, okay? This is a pretty outdated term. It was popular 1920s, 1930s, okay? There were scales for measuring it in the prison population. And the first version of the DSM did have sociopathy, but it overlapped so much with antisocial personality disorder that it was replaced in subsequent editions of the DSM with antisocial personality disorder. So sociopathy is not a term we use anymore in forensic psychology, okay? But if you were to ask what it is, it's more like antisocial personality disorder than it is psychopathy, okay? In terms of its definition and in terms of how it's assessed and the characteristics, it's more like antisocial personality disorder. The definition really refers to psychopathic traits that are due to a lack of socialization, okay? They're due to environmental circumstances, whereas psychopathy quite often has a genetic component to it, okay? So psychopaths are not insane, okay? They know the difference between right and wrong. They just don't care. So it's not a defense, okay, at trial. In fact, psychopaths are more likely to get a harsher prison sentence, more likely to get the death penalty, less likely to get parole and so on, okay? So it's not going to help in a defense at all when one is at trial. And this is really where the concept comes from. It comes from observations in the 1800s, okay, that there was a subset of criminals who were not mentally ill. There was cognitively nothing wrong with them, okay? There was only something wrong with their morals and their personality, and that's where the term psychopathy is coming from. There is often a misconception that psychopaths are criminal masterminds, okay, that they're all like Hannibal Lecter and these other, you know, criminal geniuses that you see on TV and in the movies and so on. In fact, there is no strong association between intelligence and psychopathy. If we compare the IQ of psychopathic offenders versus non-psychopathic offenders, then yes, psychopathic offenders are significantly higher in IQ than non-psychopathic offenders, okay? But that's not too surprising because as a generalization, offenders have a lower IQ than the general public, okay? If we compare the IQ of psychopathic offenders to the general public, there's no significant difference, okay? So they're not substantially higher in IQ than the general public, okay? They're just higher in intelligence than the typical offender, okay? In correlational studies, there's usually a non-significant correlation or a weak significant correlation, okay? But it's weak at best in terms of the association between psychopathy and intelligence. So in a moment, I'm going to ask you to begin thinking about some psychopathic figures and characters, maybe from books or movies or TV shows and so on. I'll just first of all give you an example that I think captures psychopathy incredibly well. There's a Dutch book called The Vanishing, and it's been made into a movie. Yeah, the European movie is significantly better, but there is an American remake if you hate subtitles, starring Jeff Bridges and Sandra Bullock, and so anyway, it's quite similar. So there's a character in it, and who really across the board of psychopathic characteristics really seems to illustrate what I'm talking about. And this is just an extract, okay, that kind of highlights this. So something willed me to the edge of the balcony. I wondered if I had the courage to jump. I kept waiting for something to stop me, anything, but nothing did. And so I jumped. Everybody's had that thought at one point, but why did I do it? It was 26 years before another experience comes to mind. Dad, there's a little girl in the water. Hurry, she's drowning. I jumped in without thinking, just like I jumped when I was 15. Dad, you're a hero. Jumping in without second thought, of course, I'm a hero. But never trust a hero. A hero is capable of rash gestures. My daughter was bursting with pride, but I thought her admiration wasn't worth anything unless I was absolutely incapable of evil. And as black cannot exist without white, I logically conceived the most horrible deed that I could envision right at that moment. And then the story is really then this character taking steps towards doing this heinous deed that he's planning out. And all the while, he's hoping that something will come up in his brain, that something will activate saying, don't do this, okay? Just like when he was 15, stepping towards the edge of the balcony, hoping that something would alert in his brain, telling him not to jump, but nothing did, okay? Because he doesn't experience fear, he doesn't experience anxiety or empathy or compassion or remorse or guilt or any of these emotions, okay? Because that's really what's missing in a psychopath, okay? They don't experience deep emotions, they're not capable of these feelings of fear, anxiety, guilt, remorse, shame, and so on. So the psychopathy checklist, like I say, the most common way of measuring psychopathy in the criminal justice system, okay, really the gold standard for measuring it, developed by Robert Hare. What would happen is someone who is trained to use it, usually a forensic psychologist, but it could be some other worker who's been trained to use this. They'll look at the background information on file of the subject, and then they'll conduct a 2-hour interview with the subject. And then the psychopathy checklist has 20 items, 20 psychopathic characteristics. And the evaluator then is assessing on a score of 0 to 2, the person's score for each of these 20 characteristics. So of course, that's a score then out of 40, okay? Now, for research purposes, we class those as being 25 or higher as a psychopath, okay? Because what we find is that those who score 25 or higher are significantly more likely to reoffend, significantly more likely to be violent, significantly less likely to be rehabilitated and respond well to treatment, okay? There is good, reliable, valid evidence, okay, for taking conclusions that when one is 25 or higher, okay, that they're then going to be more of a danger to the public. And in many countries, such as the UK, 25 also then is the level in which one is classed as a psychopath in the criminal justice system if they score it. Here in the US, the consequences, because you have the death penalty, of being classed as a psychopath is much more severe than it is in many other countries. And so the level is 30, okay? one has to be at 30 or more in order to be classed as a psychopath. And again, that's because psychopaths are more likely to get the death penalty, more likely to get a longer prison sentence, less likely to get parole, and so on. There is also a youth version of measuring psychopathy in teenage offenders, and they would be more likely to be tried as adults if they're classed as a psychopath, would be less likely to go back to the custody of their parents, more likely to be held by the criminal justice system if they're classed as a psychopath. Now, these 20 characteristics can really be grouped into 4 separate factors through factor analysis. I'm going to show this on the next slide. And then 2 of the factors really can be put into a kind of super factor, if you like, and the other 2 factors into another super factor. So one of these broader factors is interpersonal affective features, and then another is the lifestyle antisocial features. Now, if someone has antisocial personality disorder, they would likely also score high in this latter broad factor of lifestyle antisocial features. It's really the former broad factor that separates psychopathy from antisocial personality disorder, because not very many of those with antisocial personality disorder would score high in this first broad factor, okay? Now, the psychopathy checklist, as I say, is well used in the criminal justice system and has pretty massive consequences, okay? The rest of one's life can be determined based upon the score that they achieve on this risk assessment tool. But it's been shown to be well valid in that it does predict who's more likely to reoffend, who's less likely to be rehabilitated, who's more likely to be violent. It has good internal consistency. It has good stability, inter-rater reliability, all the forms of reliability, okay? So what that means is if you score high in one of these characteristics, you're likely to score high in the others. It means that if you have the test retaken months later or years later, your score is likely to be pretty much the exact same, okay? It doesn't really change. And also it means that if multiple forensic psychologists all assess the same person, their scores are very, very similar to one another, okay? So here are the 4 factors that I'm describing that make up psychopathy. So I'll discuss these 2 first. They're the ones similar to antisocial personality disorder, okay? Or we would expect to also be found in those with antisocial personality disorder. So the antisocial characteristics are to do with early childhood problems, juvenile delinquency, behavior problems from an early age. So usually these were hyperactive, stimulation-seeking, fearless children who were incredibly hard to socialize, okay? It was incredibly difficult to teach them right from wrong. And then also a wide range of criminal behavior, okay? It's not that they've just committed this one crime, okay? It's that they're capable of committing a wide range of antisocial offenses. And then the lifestyle characteristics are really to do with impulsivity and irresponsibility, okay? As Freud would have said, someone run by their id, okay, who's working on the pleasure principle, okay? They want what they want when they want it, without any regard for others or consequences, okay? They're seeking immediate gratification, okay, rather than planning ahead, okay? What can I get right now, okay? That's what I'm going to operate on, okay? So lack of realistic goals, unsurprising, stimulation seeking, a kind of parasite-like lifestyle, leeching off others. And then this affective factor is to do with the deficit in emotions, okay? Shallow emotions only at best, callousness, a lack of empathy, lack of regard for others, lack of anxiety, fear, shame, guilt, remorse, a failure to accept responsibility. And then the interpersonal characteristics are to do with narcissism, grandiosity, high self-worth, superficial charm, pathological lying, gift of the gab, okay? All of these sorts of characteristics. And again, the affective interpersonal characteristics are really what separates psychopathy from antisocial personality disorder, okay? They're the less common characteristics in the criminal population, okay? So what I'd like you to do is just take a few minutes in small groups, 2s or 3s is fine. Think of one character from either a TV show or a movie, something that you've all seen. And then think, I'm choosing someone who's psychopathic. Which of these traits can you observe in this person, okay, that to you tells you that they're psychopathic? And can you find evidence to back it up? So for example, if I was to choose Dexter, then maybe one of the characteristics I would choose a superficial charm. I would use evidence such as that he flirts with women just to keep off appearances and to appear normal. Pathological lying, that he lies frequently and easily, often just for self-preservation, that he can con others, right? Lacking in remorse for his victims, callousness, doesn't really have any empathy for his victims, okay? So doing something similar, picking up character, okay, and then listing some of the characteristics from the slide here and some evidence to back it up. Now, there are also self-reports used for measuring psychopathy. One frequent example is the psychopathic personality inventory. So just some examples of items that are used in this. So, when I want to, I can put fears and worries out of my mind because, psychopaths are not prone to anxiety or stress or fear. I find the movie stunt person exciting, right? Getting to that stimulation seeking, right? So long as someone's there to put out the flames. And I have to admit, I'm a bit of a materialist, right? Because again, a psychopath is drawn to status, something that shows their dominance, but also they're pretty superficial as well. Now, there's always issues with self-reports in psychology, okay, in any kind of personality measurement. But when we're assessing psychopathy, why might self-reports be especially problematic, even more so than in a typical case? Than say if we were measuring extroversion or self-reported self-esteem or self-reported sociability, why might it be even harder when self-reporting for psychopathy? Yeah. Right. So the fact that they're manipulative and deceptive by nature is going to make it hard. Yeah. Any other points? I mean, first of all, depending upon the situation, the person might not want to be identified as a psychopath, right? So that's then when the manipulation might come into it. But also, psychopaths are not always very self-aware, okay? And so they might not realize that there is these deficits in themselves, that they're lacking in emotions and so on in comparison to other people. And also, because they're not so self-aware and introspective, they might not be aware on exactly how they make sense of their emotions, right? So, for example, do you feel bad you killed this person? Well, I'm in prison and I don't like that. So yeah, I must feel bad, okay? Not really getting to the actual core of the question, which is about remorse and guilt, right? So some differences between psychopathic offenders and non-psychopathic offenders is that they typically start their criminal careers at an earlier age, and then their crimes persist for longer, okay? And they also commit a greater range of different crimes and are more likely to be violent in nature and are more likely to reoffend. Now, most crimes that are committed are reactive, right? About 85 to 90% of violent offenses are reactive in nature. They're not premeditated, but they're as a result of a disagreement or being provoked or some sort of in the heat of the moment conflict. But psychopaths are significantly more likely to commit proactive or instrumental, the other type of aggression, okay, than the other types of offenders, the non-psychopathic types. So they're more likely to plan out their crimes. The crimes are more likely to be organized. They're also more likely to target strangers, okay, because when it comes to reactive offenses, it's quite often, for example, a spouse or a family member or someone close. Um, Now, just as a reminder, in the first module, when we were looking at risk factors for violence, we looked at the fact that in killers, there is quite often a frontal lobe damage, especially the prefrontal cortex seems to be impaired. And this would make sense because the prefrontal cortex is responsible for a wide range of executive functions, from making good decisions, from planning ahead to problem solving and so on. And most offenders are lower in IQ. They're quite temperamental and their crimes are reactive, okay? So their crimes are spontaneous and haphazard in the heat of the moment, okay? But we found some exceptions, right? We looked at the multiple murderer who didn't have this dysfunction, okay? His prefrontal cortex was working as normal. And so it might be the case that just looking at the prefrontal cortex might not be enough to get us insights into what's happening in the brain in a psychopathic offender. We may have to also look for other pieces of the puzzle in order to get insight into this. Now, there are brain differences between psychopaths and non-psychopaths that can help us make sense of their behaviors, even if they don't have the same impairments to the prefrontal cortex. One example is Cavin septum pellucidum. So when you're born, your brain looks like this picture here on the right, okay? You have this fluid-filled sac, okay, in the center. And then as the limbic system develops, okay, the limbic system is in the center of the brain, right, in the temporal lobe, okay, responsible for emotions and memory. And what happens is, as the limbic system develops, it forms around this and puts pressure on these two separate parts that you see in the center, okay, and forces them together, okay? And as the limbic system develops, they're forcing together, they're fusing then together. And within 6 months, the brain then looks like this picture here on the left, okay? And these two parts have then been fused together. But for a small subset of the population, this doesn't occur, okay? And their brain always looks like the picture on the right. And we call that condition Cavin septum pellucidum, okay? Now, what we find is that those with Cavin septum pellucidum have a number of significant differences from those without. They're significantly more likely to have antisocial personality disorder. They score substantially higher in psychopathy. They're significantly more likely to be arrested for a crime and significantly more likely to be convicted for a crime. Now, why would this be? Okay, obviously, there's nothing about this fluid-filled sac itself, okay, that directly causes one to be criminal, okay? But what having Cavin septum pellucidum indicates is that there has been something irregular when it comes to the development of the limbic system, okay? It hasn't developed typically, because if it did develop typically, it would have put pressure on this part of the brain, fusing them together, okay? And so it tells us then that maybe that's where we need to look, okay, to see where the differences are between psychopaths and non-psychopaths. That maybe the difference resides within the limbic system, okay? Because the limbic system hasn't developed as it typically does in this population. I'm going to come back to that, narrow down on what part of the limbic system might be relevant. Okay, so we also have other evidence, Cavin septum pellucidum, more likely to increase the odds of psychopathy, instrumental aggression, disruptive behavioral disorders. Okay, so I'm going to come back to this point, okay, on the limbic system. Other early indicators of developing psychopathy, other than Cavin septum pellucidum, are also some temperament traits, okay? So we usually use the term personality when talking about adults because it takes time for personality to develop. We use the term temperament when talking about children. We talked about this in the first module. And these temperament traits are behavioral styles, right, that are fairly stable, okay, that can help us describe the typical characteristics of that particular child. Now, even at the age of 3, fearlessness at age 3 and stimulation seeking at age 3 can predict psychopathy later in adulthood. Okay, it's a pretty strong effect. Okay, so even at an early age, there were differences, okay, between those who grew up to be psychopathic. They were fearless as a child. They weren't prone to anxiety. They weren't prone to worry, okay? They didn't really learn through punishments, okay, because they weren't really fearful of consequences, okay? That made them difficult to socialize, right? And then they were also stimulation seeking, always on the go, hyperactive, okay? Reward seeking, okay, looking for immediate gratification, even at an early age, okay? Now, other differences between psychopaths and non-psychopaths emerge if we ask individuals to complete a moral decision task or a moral decision dilemma. So in this study by Andrea Glenn at the University of Alabama, what happened was that participants are undergoing a brain scan, but at the same time as having their brain scanned, they're completing a number of moral dilemmas, okay? So one example is the footbridge dilemma that you've probably heard of before. You're the person on the bridge and there's a runaway tram, okay? It's gonna kill 5 people further down the track, but you can save them all. There's a large gentleman also on the bridge and you can push him off, okay, blocking the tram and then saving the 5 lives. So imagine that you're the participant in this study, you're in the brain scan. This is the moral dilemma that's posed to you. You have to consider what you would do if you were in the situation, okay? Would you push the large gentleman off the bridge or not? Would it be right to do so? Okay, so you think for yourself for just a second, okay? If you were in this situation, okay, what do you think is the right course of action? What would you do? And the actual answer you come to is not really what the researchers are concerned about. What they're interested in is what's happening in your brain as you consider the moral dilemma, okay? For most people to actually put yourself in this situation, it would be a little bit uncomfortable, right? It would evoke some emotion, okay? And, you know, this is just one of the examples of the moral dilemma, okay? There's a range of them. So one, for example, is, you know, you're with a group and you're hiding from soldiers and you're holding on to a baby that's crying. The baby's cries are going to alert the soldiers and you're all going to be executed. Okay, would it be right then to maybe smother this baby to death in order to save the lives of yourself and the group? Okay, and again, these scenarios would be, for most people, quite uncomfortable to actually imagine yourself in that scenario. They would evoke some emotion. Now, the amygdala is really the center point for emotion, okay? It's a wide network in the brain that's involved in emotion, but if we think of it as an orchestra, then the amygdala is the conductor, okay? The amygdala really is the center point. And what we find is in people that the amygdala becomes active, okay, once they're considering these moral dilemmas, which makes sense because we're evoking emotion, which evokes activity in the amygdala, okay? But for the psychopathic individuals, okay, there is no activation in the amygdala, okay? It's significantly reduced, which tells us that this emotion isn't being evoked, okay? Now, in actuality, psychopaths are more likely to push the gentleman off the bridge than non-psychopaths, okay? But the decision isn't what we're interested in. What we're interested in is how easy of a decision it is for them to make, because it's non-emotional, okay? It evokes nothing in them. So, moreover, reduced amygdala activity was associated with higher scores in all 4 of the factors, okay, that make up psychopathy in this study. So we have evidence there that the amygdala is less functional in psychopaths than the typical person. In fact, it is also smaller, okay, 18% smaller in psychopaths on average than non-psychopaths. First observed by Yang and then subsequently replicated, also finding an 18% reduction in different samples, okay, that the psychopaths had an 18% smaller amygdala on average than non-psychopaths. Now, again, this isn't to suggest that offenders don't know right from wrong, right? Again, it's not a defense, it's not an insanity defense, okay? What it's telling us is that there is no emotional reaction, okay? The idea of doing something wrong, the idea of hurting someone evokes no emotion in them, okay? Now, obviously, regardless of, even just knowing the difference between right and wrong, okay, it's going to be more likely you'll do the right thing if you also have some emotional reaction, right? And you can think about this in terms of, whether you clean your room or whether you keep a clean apartment and so on. You're supposed to, right? You're supposed to regularly clean up and so on. But how clean you actually are will largely be determined by how disgusted you are by mess, okay? Your disgust sensitivity, okay? Regardless of whether you know that you should clean up, okay? If you're easily disgusted by mess, you're going to be cleaning up all the time, okay? Whereas if you have a pretty low level of disgust sensitivity, it takes a lot to disgust you, okay? Then you're going to tolerate more mess, okay? The same here, right? Even if you know the difference between right and wrong, you're more likely to do the right thing if doing the bad thing causes you some guilt and some negative emotions, okay? Whereas if you have no emotional reaction either way, okay, then it might be more likely that you'll do the wrong thing. Now, these are correlational studies, right? We're finding that psychopaths have a less active amygdala and a smaller amygdala, but they're correlational findings. It might be the case, you could argue, that living a psychopathic lifestyle has a negative impact on the amygdala, shrinking it and making it less active. We know that the brain is always adapting. If you use parts of the brain, then those parts of the brain become more active. If you neglect certain parts of the brain because you're not engaging in certain activities or stimulation, then those parts of the brain shrink and become less active. In order to demonstrate causality, what we would need was some longitudinal study that would tell us that amygdala volume was measured at this age early in life, and then it stayed that way, and that those who had a reduced amygdala at an early age were more likely to be psychopathic once they were adults in comparison to those with a normal-sized amygdala. Now, currently, there are such studies underway, okay? But they're a long way off from being into adulthood, okay? The follow-ups are in the middle childhood at this point, okay? But what we do have are proxies for amygdala functioning, okay? So this is a study to illustrate this from Mauritius. And we have a sample of nearly 2,000 or 1,800 children, all age-free, okay? And their fear conditioning is assessed. So essentially what's happening here is we're measuring sweat production in response to a neutral stimulus, and we're measuring sweat production in response to a conditioned stimulus that they've been conditioned to be afraid of, okay? So like the baby Albert study, right? In the baby Albert study, the rats was paired with this horrible noise, thus instilling a fear of rats into baby Alberts, okay? The study is similar, but less ethically questionable. They've been shown a picture, and then a kind of high frequency noise that's not very comfortable to listen to has played, increasing their levels of sweat production and their level of stress, okay? And then they've been shown this picture again and measuring their sweat production, and in comparison to being shown a picture they've never seen before, okay, that they haven't been conditioned to feel one way or the other about. Now, 20 years later, 137 of this group have a criminal record, and they're matched 2-to-1 to controls matched upon ethnicity, gender, social adversity, other potential confounds, early signs of shyness, and other temperamental characteristics. And what we find is that the criminals, even at age 3, showed reduced fear conditioning, okay, in comparison to the controls. So the blue group here is the group who grew up to be non-criminals, the controls, okay? We see their sweat production in response to the non-conditioned stimulus, okay, the neutral stimulus, okay? And then we see their sweat production in response to the conditioned stimulus that they've been conditioned to be afraid of. It's substantially higher, right? When they were 3 years old, 20 years ago, they showed a lot more sweat production to this stimulus than the neutral stimulus. But look at the red line, okay? We have the criminals here who grew up to be criminals, but if we look at their sweat production 20 years ago, there's no significant difference, okay, between the neutral stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, okay? So fear conditioning did not occur, okay? Now this is tied to the functioning of the amygdala because we know that the amygdala is crucial for fear conditioning, okay? In those with an overreactive amygdala, okay, they have anxiety disorders and post-traumatic stress disorder flashbacks and frightening dreams, okay? If we remove the amygdala from animals like race monkeys, they no longer show fear and no longer can have fear instilled into them, okay? And psychopaths, right? Less active amygdala, smaller amygdala, are less fearful, less anxious, and so on. So what this tells us is that poor fear conditioning at age 3 predisposes one to being a criminal, okay, 20 years later, and which tells us really amygdala dysfunction is playing a role. So in the baby Albert study, right, baby Albert had a typical amygdala. Otherwise, the experiment would not have worked, okay? The fact that he had a fear of rats instilled into him tells us that fear conditioning occurred. His amygdala operated as normal, okay? Otherwise, he wouldn't have had this fear of rats generated. So why is it then that a lack of fear conditioning predisposes one to be criminal? Well, there's a whole range of explanations you can come up with, right? If you're less fearful of consequences, it's more likely you'll do the wrong thing, right? You can't be socialized as easily because you can't be conditioned. You can't learn through punishments, okay? You can't learn through the typical classical conditioning operation. You know, if I thought about, robbing a store after work today, right? What would happen? My heart would begin to increase. I would have increase in sweat production. And this also would have a number of other factors associated with it, right? Like lightheadedness and change in breathing and so on. And that would deter me from going ahead with the crime. But that would be because of previous experiences, right? Because of hearing previous stimuli that I've learned if I do the wrong thing, bad things will happen to me, right? It's a product of conditioning. But if you're not able to pair the experience with any feeling, okay, then that conditioning won't occur. Okay, I have one last thing to talk about, okay, before we finish up, which is the striatum. Now, the striatum is the part of the brain that's involved in the reward circuits, okay? Responding to incentive rewards and encourages you to go after what it is that you want, okay? Encouraging approach behavior, motivating you, okay? So those who are more reward seeking have a larger, more active striatum, okay? Extroverts have a larger, more active striatum than introverts. And what Andrea Glenn found was that the striatum was 9.6% larger in psychopaths than non-psychopaths, okay? A finding that was replicated by Choi and Rain in 2020, finding that the striatum was 9.4% larger in psychopaths than non-psychopaths. Now, interestingly, as Andrea Glenn was doing this study, Buck Holtz and colleagues at Harvard also had a similar idea that maybe the striatum is associated with psychopathy. But they went at it in a different way. Instead of measuring the size and comparing the size, they measured the activity of it, okay, the functionality. And so how sensitive it was in response to rewards. And what they found was that the striatum was hypersensitive in the psychopaths in comparison to the non-psychopaths. So it was more responsive to rewards. It was more active. Now, it's interesting that both of these researchers came to these findings pretty independently, not knowing of the other's research, okay? It gives us more confidence in the fact that this is really a part of the brain that's associated with psychopathy, right? Because there's two sources of evidence. You know, if you hear it and see it, it's more likely to be real than just hearing it, okay? Because one sense might be wrong. So if we put all of this together, what it tells us is that maybe psychopathy is a question of balance, okay? Maybe that's at the core of explaining this disorder, okay? Because those who are psychopathic are low on punishment sensitivity, okay? They're not prone to anxiety or fear or stress. They don't worry about consequences or punishments, okay? And in line with this, they don't fear condition. The amygdala is smaller. The amygdala is less active, okay? So there's no foot on the brakes, right? Okay, there's nothing to, hold them back, okay? Instead, the foot's full down on the accelerator because they're incredibly reward seeking, right? They're hypersensitive to rewards, okay? They're pleasure seeking, looking for immediate gratification. And so maybe this disruption to the balance, okay, is what's really causing psychopathic criminal behavior. In terms of how this lines up with personality traits in psychology, the most prominent model is the Big Five model, right, in psychology. Now, neuroticism is the Big Five factor to do with anxiety and negative emotion, okay? Psychopaths score low on this. They score substantially lower than non-psychopaths, okay? Extroversion is the Big Five factor that's associated with, yes, sociability, but also enthusiasm and pleasure-seeking and reward-seeking behavior. And psychopaths score significantly higher in extroversion, okay, than non-psychopaths, okay? So that's where the two, factors from the personality literature would line up with this. Okay, is there any questions on anything I've said? So yeah. Yeah, that's a good point. So the question is whether they would respond well to positive reinforcement. So yeah, psychopaths learn pretty typically when it comes to rewards, okay? They just don't learn through punishments, okay? Yeah. Anything else? Okay, keep in mind that, all of these don't negate the social factors, okay? And I'm going to come back to talk about some of the social factors next time. And none of these biomarkers on their own are diagnostic. I also want to talk about some social or environmental risk factors. But of course, these, often go hand in hand with the biological ones. They interact. What might be the impact of a traumatic experience on the brain? We know that chronic persistent stress early in life, whether it's extreme poverty or physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, any one of these sources of persistent stress early in life can have a negative impact on the limbic system, okay? It can lead to the amygdala becoming smaller in size and to the hippocampus also becoming smaller in size. Now, the hippocampus is the part of the brain involved in the consolidation of memory that I told you a little bit about. And the amygdala, of course, is that center point for emotion and crucial for conditioning. Now, what the research is largely suggesting is that the negative effects to the hippocampus are reversible, okay, through stimulation, through cognitive exercises, okay, the hippocampus can become larger. And we know that the hippocampus is a part of the brain that's fairly fluid. I think I told you about this study, but in London, taxi drivers undergo a pretty intense 6-month training program, learning about all the various routes in London so they can get from one point to the other point in the shortest time possible. And the hippocampus actually gets larger after this or during this program in comparison to the size before. There's little to no evidence, though, suggesting that the effects to the amygdala can be reversed. Okay, this seems to be a part of the brain that once it's shrunken, once damage is done, is much harder to reverse. We talked in the first module about how material deprivation might lead to psychopathic traits, how, sense of security is crucial for healthy social, emotional development early in life. And I told you about the thieves study by John Bowlby. this is a somewhat similar study, but it's much better. It's more experimental in its design. So what we have here is a low maternal care group on the left and a high maternal care group on the right. So the high maternal group, they have parents who wanted them. They have parents who were around, parents who were monitoring them. And then the low maternal group, a group who had experienced some prolonged separation and who had a mother who didn't want them even from the beginning. And then in the lines here, we have whether they experienced abuse or not. Okay, so we have the below the low abuse group, which is the darker blue line, and then a high abuse group who experienced severe maltreatment, okay, across their childhood, which is the more green line. Now you can see on the y-axis as the outcome variable, we have psychopathy, okay, later in life. And for the low maternal care group, right, their psychopathy scores are higher than that of the high maternal care group, as we might expect based upon John Bowlby's research and theory. But it's only really particularly substantially above the norm if we look at also whether one was abused or not. Okay, it's if one experienced this low maternal care and severe abuse, okay, in which they then have the most heightened risk, okay, of then becoming more psychopathic once they're older. Another study along these lines, it's doing both a correlational study and a longitudinal design, okay? So we have over 300 male and female community participants in the correlational study who are completing a psychopathic assessment and also then a questionnaire asking them retrospectively on their maternal care, okay? And what we find is a significant, moderate-ish negative correlation, right? That as maternal care went down, psychopathy went up, okay? And then in the longitudinal study, we have a group in the lighter blue who were lacking this maternal care, who were separated from their mother, perhaps because of a bad household or other factors, okay, that went into the system. And then a group in the darker blue group who didn't experience this maternal deprivation or separation, okay, who were raised in a stable environment. And then again, on the y-axis, we have psychopathy, and we're seeing a significant difference. In this case, it's a large effect, okay? So from both the correlational study and the longitudinal study, we're finding further evidence that maternal bonding is crucial for healthy social and emotional development. So what are the causes of psychopathy? There's a wide range of possibilities, right, that we've covered not only this week, but also in the first module. These run from genetics. We've seen that there is a heritable component to psychopathy and antisociality. Exactly what it is that's being passed on from one generation to the next, we don't know for sure, and this could differ from case to case. It might be a low resting heart rate, it might be a propensity for fearlessness, it might be stimulation seeking or hyperactivity or some other relevant temperament traits that we've looked at. It could be a lack of maternal bonding, it could be a bad family environment. This is when social learning would apply, right? If one is witnessing violence from an early age. It could be this stimulation seeking, low levels of arousal, right? And the lack of conditioning, perhaps because of a defected amygdala, right? But they don't learn from punishments. They don't fear consequences for their actions, okay? And this is when the fearlessness hypothesis is coming in. We've also seen the Cavin septum pellucidum increases the odds, which indicates the limbic system hasn't developed typically. And then some other factors are low levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone, particularly if it's paired with above average testosterone baseline rates, okay? So there is a wide range of possible factors, okay, that can cause, if you like, psychopathy, both social and biological. But the biggest impacts come from a combination of both, okay, when there is both the biological and the social risk factors. So if we know this, what might we be able to do with it might be one question. Perhaps, for example, could we use it to predict later violence if we are able to, for example, see that Cavin, septum, pellucidum is present, or these traits, these temperament traits that we've seen to be relevant are present, or a defected amygdala, and so on. Well, one study examining this has looked at the amygdala volume of inmates and then followed up to measure recidivism, reoffending, okay? And so what we have here in the light blue group is those with a small amygdala, okay? We saw last time that psychopaths on average have a amygdala that's 18% smaller, and psychopathy is one of the best predictors of reoffending, okay? And then in the dark blue group, we have average amygdala volume, okay? And then what we're following up on is violent offending, okay? Do they reoffend with a violent crime? So in the dark blue group, we have average rates thereabouts of recidivism, okay? Around 15 to 20%, okay? And chances of reoffending. But what about in the light blue group, okay? That with low amygdala volume, regardless of whether we look at the left amygdala or the right amygdala, okay? Now, the reoffending rate is about 58 to 60%, okay? It's about a threefold increase. Only looking at this one factor, that's a pretty dramatic increase in reoffending rates, okay? Now, right now, risk assessing is one of the most frequent jobs that a forensic psychologist will do. They'll assess the level of risk of someone to help determine whether they should get parole, what their sentence should be, and so on. And right now, biological factors are not taken into account, okay? We look at social factors, whether they were abused, their attachment style, their education, their likelihood of getting a job, their skills, so on, their social network. Okay, these are the factors that are assessed, okay? Also personality traits, okay? But not biological factors themselves. Now, the question, to debate is, should we really look at these biological factors? On one end, many people would feel uncomfortable with this, right? It feels not too wrong to deny someone parole on the basis that they haven't got the education to get a good job, or they haven't taken part in the intervention programs available to them in prison. Some social risk factors that you can use to say this person is at high risk, they're going to stay in prison. A lot of people won't be so bothered by that as they would be by biological factors, and which is outside someone's control, right? You're not getting parole because your amygdala is too small, right? That may be something that a lot of people won't sit well with, right? Because it's out with their control. But on the other end, would it not be unethical to not include this information, knowing that we get better predictive power by including it, right? Knowing that we can decrease reoffending rates, that we can prevent future sexual assaults and future murders and so on by including this information in risk assessments, would that not be the part that's unethical? And again, it's an ongoing debate, okay? But the evidence would suggest that by including biological risk factors, we would get better accuracy over who's more likely to reoffend. So do psychopaths respond well to treatment? I already kind of answered that in that for the most part, they don't. Psychopathy is a good predictor of not rehabilitating, at least in comparison to those lower in psychopathy. However, the studies, first of all, are difficult to do, okay? First of all, you can't deny someone treatment for research purposes, okay? So you can't really get a true experiment, okay? It's more likely to be a quasi-experiment in which, we're comparing someone at this prison, this facility, when treatment was offered versus this facility when treatment wasn't offered, or someone who dropped out of treatment versus someone who stayed in treatment. And then there's a whole bunch of confounding variables, right? So to demonstrate actual cause and effect is difficult. But one study that's been kind of well cited as evidence as to why psychopaths should be given longer sentences, why they should be given the death penalty, why they're a danger to the community, is this study by Rice and colleagues, in which there was 4 groups, depending upon whether they are psychopathic or not, and depending upon whether they received treatment or not. Okay, so we have untreated non-psychopaths. Their reoffending rate is 39%. That's pretty high, right? For the treated non-psychopaths, it's more like average, about 22% reoffending rate. But then look at the psychopaths. Regardless of whether they received treatment or not, their chances of reoffending are above 50-50, right? In untreated cases, 55% of the time. And actually the highest group is the treated group. 77% of them reoffended, okay, indicating that the treatment really had no positive effect whatsoever. Now, this is a study, like I say, that's been well cited, but more recently, psychologists have taken a more critical eye to it, okay, because the follow-up and publication was done in 1992, okay? So we're really looking at inmates who went into prison around the 1970s, okay? And psychological treatment was not at its best at this time, right? And in fact, we could argue that in many cases, it was counterproductive, right? There was many experimental treatments at this time. There was shock therapy that we know had counterproductive results, experimental drugs, and even nude therapy was something that was tried for a time under Abraham Maslow's time as the president of the APA, okay, in which it was thought that if the client was nude, then that might help bonding with the therapist, okay. So a lot of these experimental approaches, okay, to therapy probably had counterproductive results, right? And so how fair or reliable is it to rely upon a study like this in which we're saying, well, they received treatment and reoffended, but the question is, did they really receive treatment? No, not very good treatment anyway, okay. More recently, the results are a little bit more promising in that psychopaths can be rehabilitated so long as the treatment is longer, more intense, and it happens at a younger age, okay? So, it certainly is still the case that what we find is that higher psychopathy rates mean it's less likely you'll be rehabilitated. But in some cases, if the program is more intense, if it's longer, okay, there can be success still found. And particularly if the intervention occurs at a younger age, okay, then it's more likely to be successful. And one example illustrating this is by Caldwell and colleagues. So in this case, we have juvenile criminals, okay, and we're measuring psychopathy on the youth version of the psychopathy checklist. Now, some of them are given treatment in an intensive treatment center, and some are given treatment in a typical correctional center. Now, reoffending rates were twice as high, okay, in the correctional setting versus those who received the more intense treatment program, okay. So again, it still is the case that psychopathy does indicate poorer rehabilitation, but there is some promise more recently, okay, so long as it's longer and more intense and happening at an earlier age. Another thing to, yeah, go on. Yeah, so good question. So, in this study, we're using the youth version of the psychopathy checklist to assess psychopathy, even though you're right, in children, we don't diagnose them as having a personality disorder. but the youth version of the psychopathy checklist is still used, not so much in the form of a clinical diagnosis, but in the forensic setting for assessing level of risk for whether this person should, go to their parents or remain in custody or try it as an adult, try it as a teen child, whatever. To make decisions such as that. The question of whether it would be beneficial to diagnose a child as a psychopath, I'm going to come back to actually, because that's a pretty complicated question that has a number of kind of points to it. Another point might be the consequences of the prison environment on the brain. Okay, so we know that stimulation, exploration, using the brain and so on, it's all good for certain parts of the brain, especially like the hippocampus. Okay, it's not surprising to find that these parts of the brain are negatively impacted once one is in prison, okay, because of the lack of stimulation and so on. Okay, and so if we're focusing right now on the impact that impairments to the brain have for increasing reoffending rates, is it the case that putting someone in prison increases the odds of reoffending once they're released because of the negative impacts on the brain? And the evidence would seem to suggest, yes, that's probably likely. So one question then might be, what can be done to mitigate this? Okay, if someone has to go to prison because they're a danger to the public and so on, what can be done if they're going to be released to lessen the negative impacts on their brain from being in prison? Okay, and one suggestion is cognitive behavioral therapy paired with mindfulness training. Okay, we know that mindfulness training and similar programs associated with this do have positive impacts on parts of the brain like the amygdala and hippocampus and other parts of the limbic system. And cognitive behavioral therapy, of course, is one of the most successful, if you like, therapies in the prison setting. So what we're doing here is giving participants an emotional go-no-go task. If you don't know what the go-no-go task is, you're told to press a key in response to a particular stimuli. So in this case, it's to particular expressions, such as a happy face. And you don't press the key in response to other stimuli. So in this case, a sad face or a different expression. And then we're measuring false presses of the key, okay? So every time you press for the one you're not meant to press for. And this is giving us some insights into, cognitive control, impulse control, and so on, but also emotion regulation. So what we have here in blue is the control group, okay, who haven't underwent any intervention, okay? And what we find is that they complete this go-no-go task once they are first incarcerated and then after 4 months of their sentence. And what we find is that false alarm rates go up, okay, indicating a decrease in cognitive control and a decrease in emotion regulation, as we would expect, okay? The question is whether this will be mitigated through the intervention, which is the green group who are having cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness training. So essentially the question is, will the effects be less severe of the 4-month prison sentence? Okay. And what we find is that, yes, false alarm rates do still go up, okay, indicating a reduction in cognitive control and emotion regulation, but it's substantially less, right? For the control group, the effect is pretty moderate to strong, about 0.3 to 0.4, right? For the experimental group, the effect's much more minimal, right? So that would suggest that this intervention did have a positive effect, a protective factor, if you like, it acted as, okay, in reducing the effect that prison had negatively on the brain. So, what I've told you so far this week by looking at this through a biological lens is essentially that bad brain equals bad behavior, right? That if there are impairments to the brain, it's more likely then that one will act antisocial. So a question then might be, what can be done to actually target the brain directly, maybe through, for example, improving nourishment, okay? So we briefly talked about this already. In fact, in the first module, we saw that those who came from malnourished mothers during pregnancy, then their odds of antisocial behavior were higher, okay, than those who came from typical mothers. What we're finding in this group is in the lighter blue group, we have a comparison group, and then the dark blue group, we have a malnourished group of children, okay, who won't be given the same vitamins and minerals and the other crucial building blocks for healthy brain development during childhood, okay? And then we're measuring their antisociality. And we're seeing, maybe not so much at age 11, but for the most part, this malnourished group are significantly higher in the antisocial behavior than the control group. And this is just one source of evidence telling this, and I showed you some in the first module as well, showing that this is a risk factor, okay, if one doesn't have access to good nutrition during brain development. So what might be an intervention for this, a biological treatment? Well, one suggestion that's been pretty well studied is omega-3. Now, omega-3 contains crucial building blocks, right, for healthy brain development, okay? In fact, about nearly a quarter of the corpus callosum that connects the two hemispheres are made up of building blocks found directly from omega-3. And so might this help reduce the antisocial behavior, right? If one is getting better brain development, better diet, better nourishment. So what we have here is the control group, first of all, which is the green group, okay? And then the blue group is a intervention group who are having omega-3 every day, they're children. And the blue group are in fact receiving a placebo, okay? Because all the children are drinking this same box fruit juice, okay, every day. But the placebo group think it's containing omega-3. In fact, it doesn't, okay? It's just a fruit juice without the omega-3 supplements. Whereas the experimental group are having this fruit juice with the omega-3 supplements in it, right? And of course, more broadly, omega-3 can be found in, fish and other sources of protein. But, for the purposes of the experiment, this might be easier for the children and to control. So what we're doing is measuring callous, unemotional traits at the beginning of the study, and then within 6 months, and then 6 months following this, okay, once the children are no longer consuming the fruit juice or omega-3 supplement. So for the control group, we see a placebo effect, right, as we would expect. As they're drinking the juice, they think their callous, unemotional traits are going down. But then 6 months after the experiment has finished, after no longer taking this juice, it's already on the rise, okay? Whereas for the blue group, by the end of the study, 6 months later, it's significantly down. And then another 6 months later, even when they're no longer still part of the experiment, it's still on the decline, indicating still promising effects, okay? Now, this intervention's been well studied with child participants. And more recently, it's also been studied with inmates to see if they can actually reduce antisociality, potentially reoffending rates. So what we have here, in this case, there's 3 groups. It's a true experiment design, a clinical trial, the same type of design used to test new medication, okay? So we have a blue group here, a light blue group, who are the control group, who receive no placebo and no intervention, right? And then the dark blue group receive the placebo. This time it's inmates in prison. They're drinking the same fruit juice as the children were given. But it contains, again, no omega-3. They just think it does, so it's a placebo. And then the green group, who have this juice, but with the omega-3 supplement contained. So we ask the inmates themselves to measure their antisocial acts, their antisocial behaviors at 0 months, 3 months in, 6 months in, and then a year later, okay? But interestingly, in this study, we also ask the officers at the prison who are looking after them to also report the inmates' antisocial behaviors. So this way we get, two independent sources of assessments, check that they're in agreement. And so for the control group, and the lighter blue group, antisociality actually briefly goes up, but for the most part, at the end of the experiment, isn't significantly different from where it started, either for the self-reports or for the reports by the officers, right? For the experiment group, it mirrors the officer reports, the self-reports do, right? It's a significant reduction in antisocial behavior according to both self-reports and according to the officers, and it remains, even a year later, significantly lower than it was at the start of the study. The placebo condition, for self-reports, we initially observe a placebo effect, and then antisociality is already going back up within 6 months. Okay. Interestingly, with the officers, the placebo group continues to increase, probably because they've been told this inmate's getting an intervention to reduce their antisociality, and the officer is not observing any difference in them, so maybe they're then overinflating their perception of how antisocial this person is. So we have, even from clinical trials, okay, good evidence that that omega-3 significantly reduces antisociality. Okay, and this is something that has a number of studies supporting it. Now, of course, no one's suggesting that it's a silver bullet, okay, and that omega-3 on its own will cure crime and violence, okay, and that if you have a problematic child, give them omega-3, and then that'll be the end of it. Okay, obviously not. But when paired with other interventions, such as therapy, it might be incredibly beneficial, because in that case, we're not only treating the social risk factors with therapy, but we're also then treating the biological risk factors with actual biological interventions. Okay, so a good question was posed on whether we should diagnose children with psychopathy, knowing that the earlier intervention occurs, the more likely it is to be successful. Okay, but what I'd like you to do is, just for a few minutes, in pairs or in just small groups of people around you, think about if it would be possible, first of all, to identify psychopathy at maybe age 6, remembering that by age 6 is about the time in which children are no longer egocentric and they begin to have feelings of empathy and shame. Would it be possible to diagnose psychopathy at this point? And if so, would it be right or wrong to do so? Okay, thinking about what the implications or consequences and so on might be. What I want to do is play a video for you, and then we'll consider some of these questions afterwards. It's a pretty different perspective. It's a journalist. He's doing a TED Talk, and he's a journalist who's pretty critical of psychology more broadly. So, keep that in mind. But he's learned to use the psychopathy checklist and the same way that a forensic psychologist might. He's been trained by Robert Hare, who developed it. And then this is just his kind of evaluation, if you like, from what he took away from the experience.
Hello. Okay, this is a talk about how to spot a psychopath. The statistic, by the way, which Robert Hare, who invented the psychopath checklist, came up with, is that 1 in 100 people is a psychopath. So there's It's 100 people in the room. So one of you is a psychopath. Yeah, more than if psychopaths enjoy going to talks about psychopaths, there could be more than one of you in the audience. And I think psychopaths do enjoy going to talks about psychopaths because of item 2, grant your sense of self-worth. So 1 in 100 regular people is a psychopath, Hare says, but 4 in 100 CEOs are psychopaths. So you're 4 times more likely to be ruled by a psychopath than you are to have one as your subordinate. Okay, so I'm now a professionally trained, and I've got to say extremely adept, psychopath spotter. And I will tell you the story of how I became a psychopath spotter and what I did with my powers. It started, I was at a friend's house, and she had on a shelf a book called the DSM. Do people know the DSM? It's the Manual of Mental Disorders. And it used to be in the 50s, it was very slim. It was like a little pamphlet, but now it's an enormous book. They've come up with a huge number of mental disorders. There's 886 pages, 374 mental disorders. So I was leafing through the book and wondering if I had any mental disorders, and it turns out I've got 12. I've got generalized anxiety disorder, which is a given. I've got nightmare disorder, which is categorized if you have recurrent dreams of being pursued or declared a failure. And all my dreams involve somebody chasing me down the street going, "You're a failure." I've got malingering, and I think it's actually quite rare to have both malingering and generalized anxiety disorder, because malingering tends to make me feel extremely anxious. And I have parent-child relational problems, which I blame my mother for. And I have caffeine-induced disorder, which I've got right now. So I was leafing through this book wondering, my goodness, am I crazier than I thought I was? Or maybe it's not a good idea to self-diagnose if you're not a trained professional. Or maybe the psychiatry industry has a strange fetish to diagnose normal behavior as a mental disorder. And I had no idea which was true. I was quite excited, by the way, to have so many mental disorders. It kind of made me feel like, you know, it's good to know there's something wrong with you. And I wondered actually whether my anxiety was a good thing. Maybe it's a thing that drives me forward to achieve. You know, maybe it makes me do interesting things. Anyway, I was wondering, you know, what is all this? So I thought it'd be interesting to meet a critic of psychiatry to get their view on it, which is how I ended up having lunch with the Scientologists, who have a crack team of psychiatry busters called the CCHR. So I said to them, can you prove to me that your thesis is right and that psychiatry is a pseudoscience? They said, yes, you can. We can prove it to you. We can introduce you to Tony. So I said, who's Tony? And I said, Tony's in Broadmoor. Now, Broadmoor is Broadmoor Hospital, which used to be known as Broadmoor Asylum for the Criminally Insane. So I said, what did Tony do? And the Scientologist said, hardly anything. He's completely sane. He beat somebody up or something. He's totally sane. He faked madness to try and get out of a prison sentence. And he faked it too well, and now he's stuck at Broadmoor. And the more he tries to convince people he's sane, the more they take it as evidence that he's crazy. Do you want us to get you into Broadmoor to meet Tony? So I said, yes, please. So I went to Broadmoor. The Scientologist got me in. It's not easy. And we were sitting in the wellness centre. Brian, the Scientologist, said, by the way, Tony's the only person in the entire DSPD unit to have permission to meet people in the wellness centre. So I said, what does DSPD stand for? And he said, Dangerous and Severe Personality Disorder. So I said, is Tony in the part of Broadmoor that houses the most dangerous people? And Brian said, yeah, isn't that crazy? So then the patients started drifting in, and most were overweight, and they were wearing sweatpants, and they looked quite docile. And then Brian said, there's Tony. And Tony came in. And he wasn't overweight. He was in extremely good shape. And he wasn't wearing sweatpants. He was wearing a pinstripe suit. And he was walking towards me with his arm outstretched like someone out of The Apprentice. Somebody wanted to convince me that he was very sane. So he sat down. And I said, so is it true that you faked your way in here? And he said, yeah. He said, I beat someone up in Reading. I was on remand in my cell, and my cellmate said, you're looking at 5 years. What you need to do, fake madness. Tell him you're mad. You'll go to some cushy hospital, nurses will bring you pizzas, you'll have a PlayStation. So I said, so how did you fake madness? He said, well, I asked to see the prison psychiatrist. I'd just seen this film called Crash by David Cronenberg, in which people get sexual pleasure from enacting car crashes. So I told the psychiatrist, I get sexual pleasure from enacting car crashes. And I said, why? I said, oh yeah, I told the psychiatrist I like to watch women as they die because it would make me feel more normal. So I said, where'd you get that from? He said, oh, from biography of Ted Bundy that they had in the prison library. So he evidently faked madness much too well. And they sent him to Broadmoor. And he took one look at the place, said, there's been a terrible mistake. I'm not mad. I said, how long have you been here for? He said, well, if I'd just done my prison sentence, I'd have got 5 years. I've been in Broadmoor for 12 years. So, for the last 12 years, he's trying to convince them that he's sane. I said, well, how do you do that? He said, well, it's not easy. I subscribe to New Scientist. I like to kind of, I try and talk to them about kind of normal things like football and so on. There was an article in New Scientist recently. They said that the US Army was training bumblebees to sniff out explosives. So I said to the nurse, did you know that the US Army is training bumblebees to sniff out explosives? He said later when he saw his case notes, they'd written, believes bees can sniff out explosives. He said, the more you try and act sane, the more crazy you seem. So Tony seemed completely sane to me, but I'm not a professional. But I left and I wondered what to do. So I decided to write to his clinician, Anthony Maiden. I said, well, what's the story? And his clinician emailed back and said, yeah, we accept that Tony's story is true. We accept that he faked madness to get out of a prison sentence because his delusions were very cliched. However, we've assessed him and we've decided that what he is a psychopath. And in fact, faking madness is exactly the kind of cunning and manipulative act of a psychopath. So faking your brain going wrong is evidence that your brain has gone wrong. He said it's on the checklist, cunning, manipulative. And I said, what else? He said, pinstripe suit, classic psychopath. That speaks to grandiose sense of self-worth and also glibness, superficial charm. Tony had told me that he didn't like to hang around with his neighbours. He had like the Stockwell Strangler on one side of him. So he stayed in his room a lot, and they take that as a sign that he's a psychopath because it speaks to lack of empathy, grandiosity. So only in Broadmoor would not wanting to hang out with serial killers be a sign of madness. So Anthony Maiden said, if you want to know more about psychopaths, you can go on a psychopath spotting course with Robert Hare, who invented the psychopath checklist. So I did. I went on a 3-day course, which is exactly the same as people who now are court experts who speak at sentencing hearings and so on to determine whether somebody is a high-scoring psychopath or not. I went on a 3-day course, and I am now an extremely adept psychopath spotter. Hare said to me repeatedly, he said, some guy in Broadmoor who may or may not have faked madness, that's not a big story. The big story is corporate psychopathy. He said, psychopathy is so powerful a brain anomaly, and it is a brain anomaly, he says. It's the amygdala doesn't send enough signals of fear and distress up and down to the central nervous system. Psychopaths are the neurological opposite of me. My amygdala sends way too many signals of fear and distress up and down to my central nervous system. So they don't feel anxious, no anxiety. He said, it's such a powerful brain anomaly that it molded society all wrong. Capitalism, at its most ruthless, is a physical manifestation of psychopathy. That's how powerful the condition is. We are all victims of psychopathy. He said, you really want to try and get an interview with a corporate psychopath. So I looked around and I chose Al Dunlap. Al Dunlap in the 1990s was a very notorious asset stripper. He would come into a company and he'd fire everybody and the share prices would shoot up. He did it at Scott, which was one of America's leading toilet paper manufacturers. He came in, closed down plants all over the place, and he'd kind of fire people quite often with a quip, with like a funny joke. So one of his stories was somebody came up to him and said, I've just bought myself a new car. And Al Dunlap said, you may have a new car, but I'll tell you what you don't have, a job. One time he went to a plant in Mobile, Alabama, and asked somebody how long he'd been working there, and the guy said 30 years. And he said, why do you want to work at a place for 30 years for? It makes no sense. And then he closed the plant down and fired everybody. He said something that wasn't psychopathic, like, for instance, he said no. I didn't ask him about promiscuous sexual behavior because his wife was there, and frankly, I'd chickened out. But he said no to juvenile delinquency. And he said no to early behaviour problems. He said, because I got accepted into West Point, and if I was a delinquent, they wouldn't have had me in. There's no rumours of affairs. He's only been married twice. Admittedly, his first wife cited in her divorce papers that he once threatened her with a knife and said, I always wondered what human flesh tasted like. But he has only been married twice. Also, by the way, he would often speak about his wise and supportive parents, but didn't turn up to either of their funerals. But even so, there was quite a few items on the psychopath checklist that didn't apply to him at all. So I thought to myself, well, I won't put that in my book. And then I realised, my goodness, being a psychopath spotter has turned me somewhat psychopathic. I was displaying lack of empathy. I was being cunning and manipulative. And it had turned me kind of power mad. And then I got a call from Tony in Broadmoor. And he said, by the way, Tony has always denied being a psychopath. He says, the problem with the checklist, he says, one of the items is lack of remorse. Another item is cunning, manipulative, and pathological lying. So if you tell them you feel remorse for your crime, I feel enormous remorse for what I did. They say, typical of the psychopath, to pretend to be remorseful when they're not. He said it's like voodoo. They turn everything upside down. And the Hare checklist is used by experts in sentencing hearings and parole and probation hearings all the time. The rest of somebody's life can be determined on how high they score on the psychopath test. Anyway, Tony said he had a tribunal planned, and would I like to come? So I went to it. And after 14 years now in Broadmoor for a crime that would have got him 5 years if he hadn't faked madness, they let him go. And he's now out. He said to me, he said, John, so what you've got to remember, everybody's a bit psychopathic. He said, you are, I am. Well, obviously I am. I said, what are you going to do now? He said, well, there's a woman in Belgium I fancy, but she's married to get her divorced. But that's okay, because we're manipulative. So Tony's out and about. I spent a long time wondering, actually, what I should think about Tony. I was worried, because part of me really wanted to support him, and another part of me thought, well, he might be a psychopath, and they have a 60% recidivism rate. What do I do? So for a while I've wondered whether I should write about him in a supportive way, but not quite good enough for it to actually work. So like campaign for his release, but quite badly, like a sort of crap Bono. But now I've decided, actually, is Tony a psychopath or is Tony a miscarriage of justice? And the answer I came up with is both. You could be a psychopath and you can also be a miscarriage of justice, because we should not be determined by a checklist, and we should be defined by our sanity and not our madness, if we possibly can. And sometimes it's our madness, it's the least attractive aspects of our personalities, it's our anxieties and our compulsions and our obsessions that lead us sometimes to do quite interesting things, that lead us to move forward and succeed. Thank you very much.
So, a different perspective there on the psychopathy checklist. What I'd like you to do is just take a couple of minutes to consider, do you think it might be right or wrong to keep someone locked up based upon their score on the psychopathy checklist? Potentially any criticisms, but the main question I'd like you to consider is, since not all psychopaths are dangerous, okay, or since not all psychopaths are criminal, rather, might there be a pro-social use for psychopathic characteristics? Might someone who is a psychopath, instead of being a criminal, is there a job that might be well suited for them in which they could positively contribute to society? Especially maybe focusing on the lack of anxiety that was talked about in the video, but you could think about the other characteristics we discussed of psychopathy. So maybe consider the other questions, but mainly I'd like you to potentially think of a job or a position, something that you think would be beneficial to society if a psychopath was in that position, and then I'll see what you think. Yeah.